For 3 years, the disappearance of twins Mia and Lily Thompson was a frustrating dead end for investigators. They were taken from their daycare in 2019, and the trail vanished almost immediately. In 2022, an unrelated disaster provided the first real lead. A hurricane exposed a hidden room on an isolated property. A DNA match offered a spark of hope, but the crime scene photographs from inside that room presented a horrific contradiction that forensics alone could not explain. The tiny copper threads of the blue wire refused to seat correctly in the terminal block. Jenna Thompson cursed under her breath, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of her third-floor apartment. It was October 2022, and the sophisticated home security system spread across her living room floor felt less like a safeguard and more like a monument to failure. The screwdriver slipped in her sweaty palm, clattering onto the hardwood floor. She leaned her forehead against the cool drywall, the unfinished panel gaping open like a wound. 3 years. 3 years since the world had tilted on its axis, since Mia and Lily had been swallowed whole by a sunny afternoon in 2019. Jenna pushed herself away from the wall, retrieving the screwdriver. This ritual, upgrading the locks, installing new sensors, reinforcing the windows, was a desperate attempt to impose order on a life defined by chaos. It never worked. The fear was an insidious vine that had already taken root inside the walls, inside her mind. Her gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, drawn inevitably to the photograph. It was the one the media had used most often, the one that captured the vibrant chaos of their life before. Mia and Lily, 5 years old, standing on the colorful foam puzzle mats of the daycare. They were identically dressed in white sweaters, the pink lettering Angels 98 emblazoned across their chests, matching pink skirts completing the outfit. Their hands were extended, palms up, as if offering the camera an invisible gift, their smiles wide and unguarded. Lily, always the more exuberant twin, was missing a front tooth. Mia, more reserved, held a hint of mischief in her eyes. The image was a knife that twisted every time she looked at it, yet she couldn't bear to put it away. It was proof they existed, that the life she remembered wasn't a fever dream. She forced her attention back to the wires, the technical diagrams blurring in her vision. She had chosen this apartment specifically for its perceived security. A single entryway, high windows, a gated parking garage. But the sanctuary she sought remained elusive. Instead, she had constructed a cell, a sterile beige existence devoid of color, of spontaneity, of joy. She had made herself small, hoping the grief wouldn't find her. But it always did. It lived in the silence, in the 2 empty bedrooms she kept closed, in the way she scrutinized every face on the street, searching for the woman who had stolen her life. The shrill ring of her cell phone shattered the silence, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet apartment. Jenna startled, the screwdriver slipping from her grasp again. She stared at the phone, vibrating on the coffee table. The caller ID flashed, Detective Miller. Her heart stuttered. Miller never called. Not anymore. The initial flurry of activity surrounding the abduction had slowed to a trickle, then dried up completely. The case had gone cold, buried under the weight of other tragedies and the relentless passage of time. For Miller to call now, on a Tuesday afternoon, meant something had changed. Something significant. She snatched the phone, her hand shaking. Detective Miller? Jenna? Miller's voice was carefully measured, urgent but restrained. It was the voice he used when delivering bad news gently, a tone she had grown to dread. What is it? Did you find something? Jenna stood up, pacing the small space between the couch and the window, her movements jerky, agitated. We might have a break, Miller said, pausing slightly. A hurricane just tore through the Gulf Coast near Panama City, a lot of damage. The owner of a long-abandoned rental property was inspecting storm damage to an outbuilding on his land. He found something, Jenna. Something hidden. Jenna stopped pacing. She pressed a hand to her mouth, the air thick and hard to breathe. Found what? A hidden room, and inside there was evidence. We sent it for rush testing. Miller paused again, and Jenna knew what was coming before he said it. We have a preliminary DNA match, Jenna. It's connected to the girls. You need to get down here. The world tilted. A DNA match. After 3 years of nothing, of silence, of agonizing uncertainty, a single thread had appeared. The relief was so sharp it felt like pain. But the fear was just as intense. Evidence in an abandoned property. What kind of evidence? "I'm on my way," she whispered, her voice cracking. She hung up the phone, the security system forgotten on the floor. The blinking green lights of the disconnected panel seemed distant, irrelevant. She grabbed her purse and keys, her movements mechanical, robotic. She needed Mark. She dialed his number, her fingers clumsy on the touch screen. He answered on the second ring, his voice distracted, the sounds of a busy office in the background. "Jenna, are you okay? You sound—" "They found something, Mark," Detective Miller called. "A DNA match." The words tumbled out, rushed and breathless. "We have to go. Now." Mark didn't hesitate. The distraction vanished from his voice, replaced by a sharp focus. "I'm leaving the office. I'll meet you at the apartment. Don't drive yet. Wait for me." The drive to the Florida Panhandle was a blur of asphalt and adrenaline. Mark drove while Jenna sat in the passenger seat, her leg bouncing nervously, her gaze fixed on the endless stretch of highway unfolding before them. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the pavement. They didn't speak much. What was there to say? Hope was a dangerous thing. They had learned that the hard way. As they drove, the fragmented memories of the abduction assaulted Jenna, a relentless barrage of guilt and regret. It was a constant companion, a suffocating weight on her chest. She had been the one to befriend Carol Peterson, the new neighbor who had moved into the house across the street just weeks before the disappearance. Carol, with her easy smile and maternal warmth. Carol, who had seemed so lonely, so eager to help. Jenna, overwhelmed by the demands of raising twins and managing a household, had been grateful for the support. She had trusted her enough to put her on the Daycare emergency contact list. It was a decision that haunted every waking moment, a catastrophic error in judgment that had destroyed their lives. She remembered the confusion of that day, the frantic calls to the daycare when Carol didn't arrive with the girls as planned, the daycare staff assuring her that the girls had been picked up hours ago, the realization that something was terribly wrong, and then the devastating truth. Carol Peterson was gone. The house across the street was empty, and Mia and Lily had vanished into thin air. The further they drove, the more the landscape changed. The manicured suburbs gave way to dense forests and sprawling farmland. The air grew heavy with the humidity of the Gulf Coast. They were entering a different world, a place where secrets could be buried deep and forgotten. Jenna stared out the window, the passing trees blurring into a monotonous green wall. Somewhere out there, her daughters had been hidden. And now, finally, the earth was giving up its secrets. The anticipation was a knot tightening in her stomach, a mixture of desperate hope and paralyzing fear. Whatever they found at the abandoned property, it would change everything. They arrived at the property late in the afternoon. The sky was a bruised purple and yellow, the aftermath of the recent storm evident everywhere. Fallen trees littered the landscape, their roots ripped out of the saturated ground like exposed nerves. The air was thick with the smell of mold, damp earth, and decaying vegetation, a scent that seemed to cling to the skin. The rental property itself was dilapidated, a small farmhouse that seemed to be sinking back into the earth, defeated by the relentless encroachment of the wilderness. Blue tarps covered parts of the roof, and the porch sagged precariously. It was the kind of place people drove past without a second glance, a forgotten corner of the world. Detective Miller was waiting for them, standing near a cluster of police vehicles parked haphazardly in the muddy driveway. He looked older than Jenna remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper, his expression grim, unreadable. He nodded curtly as they approached, the gesture devoid of the usual sympathy. "Jenna, Mark?" He acknowledged them with a weary familiarity. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "Where are they?" Jenna's voice was tight, strained. She needed to see it, needed to know what they had found. The uncertainty was agonizing. "The evidence is being processed," Miller said gently, his tone shifting slightly, recognizing the raw edge of her desperation. "But I wanted you to see the location. It might help us understand what happened here." He led them around the side of the house, through the overgrown yard, towards a small, unassuming outbuilding. It looked like a tool shed or a detached garage, the wood siding gray and weathered. The storm had taken its toll here, too. One wall had partially collapsed, the wooden slats splintered and broken, exposing the interior like a gaping wound. The property owner came out to assess the damage, Miller explained as they walked, his voice low, clinical. When he saw the collapsed wall, he noticed something odd. A space that shouldn't have been there. They reached the outbuilding. A crime scene technician was dusting for prints near the entrance, the movements meticulous, precise. Miller stopped them before they got too close, the yellow crime scene tape a stark barrier between them and the answers they sought. "This is an active scene. Please don't touch anything." Jenna peered into the gloom. The interior was cramped and cluttered. Old gardening tools, rusted bicycles, and discarded furniture filled the space, a chaotic jumble of forgotten lives. But in the center of the room something stood out. An old white washing machine, slightly yellowed with age, had been moved away from the back wall, and behind it, near the floor, was a small dark opening, a crawl space. Jenna felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. It was a primal fear, the kind that tightens the stomach and quickens the pulse. A hidden space, a secret room, the realization of what it meant, what it implied, was terrifying. "What was in there?" Mark asked, his voice rough, strained. Miller didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled a stack of photographs from a manila envelope he was carrying. These were taken by the forensic team last night. He handed the photos to Jenna. She shuffled through them, her hands trembling. The first few images showed the interior of the crawl space. It was small, barely large enough for an adult to crouch in. The walls were rough, unfinished concrete, but it was the floor that drew her attention. It was covered in a low-pile, beige-colored carpet. And on the carpet, Jenna gasped, the sound sharp, ragged. The next photograph was taken under UV light. The carpet glowed with an eerie, neon blue luminescence. Large, irregular stains spread across the surface, bright and intense against the muted background. They looked like splashes, pools, spatters. In the midst of the glowing patches were two bright yellow evidence markers, labeled 1 and 2. "Luminol," Miller said quietly, confirming what Jenna already knew. "It reacts with the iron in hemoglobin." "Those stains. They're blood, Jenna. A significant amount." The world seemed to recede, the sounds of the crime scene fading into a dull roar. Blood. Her daughter's blood. The DNA match. The reality of it hit her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a place where they had been held. This was a place where violence had occurred. She stared at the photograph, the glowing blue stains searing themselves into her memory. It was a horrific image, sterile and clinical, yet deeply intimate. This was the evidence of her children's suffering, the silent testament to a nightmare she couldn't comprehend. Is it both of them?" Mark asked, his voice choked with emotion. He was staring at the photographs, his face pale, his eyes wide with horror. "We don't know yet," Miller admitted, his voice softening slightly. "The preliminary match confirms the DNA belongs to the Thompson family line. We're running more specific tests now to differentiate between the twins. But given the amount of blood—" He let the sentence hang unfinished, the implication clear. Jenna couldn't tear her eyes away from the photographs. She felt sick, hollowed out. The hope that had flared so brightly on the drive down was rapidly extinguishing, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The confirmation she had sought for so long now felt like a curse. She forced herself to look back at the outbuilding, at the dark opening behind the washing machine. She needed to see inside. Ignoring Miller's warning, she stepped closer, crouching down to peer into the crawl space. The smell hit her first, musty, metallic, the faint coppery scent of old blood. But beneath that, something else. Something sickly sweet. The scent of childhood, faint traces of baby powder, fruit snacks, the familiar smell of her daughters. Miller gently pulled her back. "Jenna, you can't go in there." But she had already seen it. The space wasn't just a hiding place. It was a home. Small, child-sized furniture was pushed against the walls, a tiny table and chairs, a shelf filled with toys, and taped to the rough concrete walls, dozens of children's drawings. A secret playroom. The perversity of it was staggering. A space decorated with the innocence of childhood, yet saturated with the evidence of violence. It was a contradiction that Jenna couldn't reconcile. The image of her daughters playing in this cramped, dark space, surrounded by the silent screams of the bloodstains, was unbearable. She stood up, her legs unsteady. She felt Mark's hand on her arm, steadying her. She leaned into his touch, grateful for the anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. "They were here," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She kept them here. The realization was devastating. For 3 years, she had imagined her daughters everywhere, in crowded malls, in passing cars, in the faces of other children. But they had been here, in this dark, cramped space, hidden away from the world, forgotten. The first lead in years, and it felt less like a breakthrough and more like a confirmation of her worst fears. It felt like a tomb. The silence that had defined the last 3 years was broken, replaced by the screaming evidence of a tragedy she couldn't yet comprehend. The hope she had clung to for so long was now stained with the agonizing certainty of their suffering. The initial shock began to subside, replaced by a cold, hard anger that burned in Jenna's chest. She turned to Miller, her eyes blazing, the grief momentarily overshadowed by the desperate need for answers. How? How could she hide them here for so long? How could no one notice? Mark echoed her questions, his voice tight with frustration, the facade of calm he had maintained crumbling under the weight of the discovery. "This property is abandoned," you said. "Who owns it? Who was renting it? Someone must have seen something." Miller sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair, the exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. "That's the problem. We're having trouble tracking down the tenant." He led them away from the outbuilding, towards the main house, as if the distance could somehow soften the blow of the information he was about to deliver. The interior of the farmhouse was musty and cluttered, the previous occupants having left behind mountains of junk, a chaotic testament to a life interrupted. "The owner lives out of state," Miller explained, kicking aside a pile of old magazines. "He inherited the property a few years ago and has been renting it out informally. No background checks, no leases, just cash transactions arranged through local classified ads." He showed them a crumpled receipt found in a kitchen drawer. It was dated July 2019, just weeks after the abduction. The name on the receipt was Carol Peterson. "She used the same alias," Jenna whispered, the name tasting bitter on her tongue. The ghost that had haunted her for 3 years was finally taking shape, solidifying into a tangible presence. "It seems so," Miller confirmed. "She paid 6 months' rent in advance, all cash. The owner never met her in person. The transaction was handled through a third party who has since disappeared." Jenna felt a surge of frustration. It was the same pattern as before. A ghost moving through the world, leaving no trace, exploiting the loopholes in the system. But someone must have seen her. Neighbors, delivery drivers, someone. "We're canvassing the area," Miller assured her, but his voice lacked conviction. "But it's isolated out here. The nearest neighbor is half a mile away, and this property, it's set back from the road, hidden by the trees. It's the perfect place to disappear." He revisited the details of the abduction, explaining the sophisticated methods the kidnapper had used. It was a story Jenna knew by heart, a script she had replayed in her mind countless times, but hearing it again in this context made her blood run cold. "She used phone spoofing technology," Miller explained, his voice taking on a clinical tone, the detachment a necessary defense mechanism against the horror of the facts. "When she called the daycare, the caller ID showed your number, Jenna. It appeared to be a legitimate call coming directly from your registered cell phone." Jenna closed her eyes, the memory of that day washing over her. The frantic confusion, the disbelief, the agonizing realization that she had been manipulated, her own identity used as a weapon against her. "She impersonated you," Miller continued, hysterical, crying, claiming you and Mark had been in a severe car accident and were being rushed to the hospital. She instructed the staff to release the girls to their neighbor, Carol Peterson, who she reminded them was on the emergency contact list. "The staff member was new," Jenna whispered, the guilt twisting inside her, a familiar ache that never faded. "She didn't follow protocol." "She thought it was a genuine emergency," Miller said gently, offering a small measure of absolution. "The call was coming from a verified number." The kidnapper was convincing. By the time the mistake was realized, it was too late. Witnesses had last seen the girls leaving with the woman in a red pickup truck. The truck was later discovered to have been stolen and abandoned miles away, wiped clean of any forensic evidence. The trail had gone cold. Until now. Miles away from the farmhouse, Detective Miller sat in his temporary command post, a cramped office in the local sheriff's department. The walls were covered in maps, timelines, and photographs from the crime scene. The ghost tenant, Carol Peterson. The name was a dead end, a manufactured identity designed to evaporate upon contact. He scrubbed a hand over his face, the stubble rasping under his palm. He had dedicated 3 years of his life to this case. The faces of Mia and Lily Thompson haunted his dreams, their smiling images a constant reminder of his failure to find them. And now, finally, he had a physical location, a place where they had lived, breathed, and bled. But the trail was already growing cold again. He studied the rental agreement again. Informal, cash, untraceable. It was a meticulous plan, executed with chilling precision. The woman they were hunting was smart, resourceful, and ruthless. She knew how to exploit the weaknesses in the system, how to move through the world unseen. He looked at the evidence logs from the outbuilding. The bloodstains suggested a sudden, violent event. A struggle? An accident? He couldn't be sure, but the amount of blood, it was significant, too significant to ignore. He analyzed the timeline. The property seemed to have been abandoned suddenly, perhaps over a year ago, mid-2021. The dust accumulation, the expired food in the pantry, the lack of recent activity. It all pointed to a sudden departure. Why had she left? Had something spooked her? Or had the tragedy that occurred in the hidden room forced her hand? He returned to the farmhouse later that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. He found Jenna and Mark sitting on the sagging porch, staring blankly at the darkening landscape, the silence between them heavy with unspoken grief. "We're doing everything we can," he assured them, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. The reality was they had very little to go on. "It's not enough," Jenna said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "She's gone. Again. And we still don't know where our daughters are." "We know they were here," Miller countered gently, trying to offer a glimmer of hope in the overwhelming darkness. "That's more than we knew yesterday. We have a starting point. We'll find her." But the reality was harsh. Carol Peterson didn't exist. The trail was cold. The vast Florida wilderness stretched out before them, an endless expanse of hiding places. The ghost tenant had vanished once again, leaving behind only the chilling evidence of her presence. The silence was deafening, the darkness absolute. Weeks bled into one another, the initial momentum generated by the discovery of the hidden room fading, replaced by the grinding monotony of the investigation. The farmhouse was processed, every inch scrutinized, every piece of evidence bagged and tagged. But the ghost tenant remained elusive. The canvassing of the area yielded nothing. No one remembered seeing a woman with 2 young girls. No one remembered Carol Peterson. The isolation that had protected her for so long continued to shroud her in anonymity. Jenna felt the familiar creep of desperation setting in, the cold realization that the investigation was stalling, the momentum lost. The police seemed to be shifting into a recovery mindset, their language subtly changing from rescue to recovery. They spoke of closure, of justice, of bringing the perpetrator to account. But Jenna clung to the hope of a rescue, a fierce primal instinct that refused to accept the possibility of defeat. She refused to believe her daughters were gone. She and Mark had rented a small cabin near the farmhouse, unable to return to their life while the investigation was ongoing, the proximity to the crime scene a necessary torment. The cabin was cramped and uncomfortable, the air thick with the smell of mildew and pine, but it allowed them to stay close, to monitor the progress, to pressure Miller for updates. Jenna became obsessed with the evidence recovered from the playroom. She needed to see it, to touch it, to understand the world her daughters had inhabited for the last 3 years. She needed to find a connection, a clue, something that the police might have overlooked. She demanded access to the photographs of the drawings found taped to the walls, the childish scrawls that held the secrets of their captivity. Miller was reluctant at first, citing the ongoing investigation, the need to preserve the integrity of the evidence. But Jenna was relentless. She argued that as the mother, she might recognize details that the police overlooked, nuances that only she would understand, the subtle language of her daughter's imagination. Finally, worn down by her persistence, Miller relented. He brought the high-resolution photographs to the cabin. Dozens of drawings, rendered in crayon and colored pencil, spread across the small kitchen table. Jenna studied them with a painful intensity, her heart aching with a mixture of love and grief. The vibrant colors, the childish strokes, the innocent depictions of a life lived in the shadows. It was a heartbreaking testament to their resilience, their ability to find beauty even in the darkest of places. The drawings depicted a disturbing narrative, a small enclosed space, the walls pressing in around the figures. 2 girls, recognizable by their matching outfits and hairstyles, their features rendered with a childish simplicity. And a larger figure, a woman they labeled New Mommy. Jenna's stomach turned. New Mommy. The kidnapper had not just stolen her daughters. She had tried to replace her, to erase her from their memory, to rewrite their history. The insidious manipulation was a violation that went beyond the physical abduction. She traced the outlines of the figures, recognizing Lily's bold strokes and Mia's meticulous details. They looked happy in some of the drawings, playing with toys, eating meals, reading books. It was a grotesque parody of a normal family life, conducted in the confines of the hidden room, a twisted fantasy orchestrated by a delusional woman. But as she moved through the chronological sequence of the drawings, a shift occurred. The tone darkened. The colors became muted. The figures grew smaller, more isolated. And then, horrifically, the drawings began to show only one girl. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Mark, her eyes wide with fear, the unspoken question hanging in the air between them. He saw it, too, the devastating implication of the missing figure. The connection to the bloodstains was undeniable, the silent confirmation of their worst fears. "Lily?" Jenna whispered, the name a prayer and a curse, the sound catching in her throat. She feared the worst. The amount of blood in the hidden room? It suggested a fatal injury. Had Lily died? Had the kidnapper killed her? The agonizing possibilities swirled in her mind, a vortex of grief and terror. But even as the grief threatened to overwhelm her, a flicker of hope remained, a desperate ember refusing to be extinguished. If Lily was gone, what about Mia? The drawings showed one girl remaining. Did that mean Mia was still alive? Had she escaped, or was she still with the kidnapper, alone and terrified, mourning the loss of her sister? Jenna pushed the agonizing questions aside and forced herself to focus on the details, the minute elements that might hold the key to their location. She needed to find a clue, a breadcrumb, anything that would point to where they had gone. She scrutinized the backgrounds of the drawings, looking for landmarks, for anything recognizable. Most of the drawings depicted the interior of the hidden room, the walls closing in around the figures, a claustrophobic world devoid of external references. But some showed an exterior view, a glimpse of the outside world seen through a small window or an open door, a tantalizing hint of a life beyond the confines of their prison. That's when she noticed it. A recurring element in the background of several drawings, the later ones featuring only one girl. Large, square boxes, stacked together in neat rows, and hovering above them, small, indistinct shapes. Insects. Buzzing insects. Jenna stared at the drawings, her mind racing, the pieces clicking into place. Boxes and insects. What did it mean? And then it clicked. Apiaries, beehives. The realization hit her with the force of an electric shock. She grabbed her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her movements frantic, energized. She started obsessively researching apiaries in the region. The Florida Panhandle was known for its Tupelo honey. There were hundreds of beekeepers scattered across the area, their hives hidden in the dense woods and open fields. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only lead they had. The drawings were a message from her daughters, a coded map leading to their location. She was convinced of it. The beehives were real. They had seen them. And now she just had to find them. The search felt impossible, the area vast and wild, the odds stacked against her. But Jenna clung to this small detail, this fragile thread of hope. The buzzing insects in the drawings were no longer just background noise, they were a beacon, calling her to find her girls, a promise whispered in the silence of their captivity. The Florida Panhandle was a world away from the manicured suburbs Jenna knew. Here, the land was wild, untamed, a dense tangle of pine forests and swamps. Elias Matthews felt most at home in this isolation. A reclusive beekeeper, he preferred the predictable rhythms of his hives to the chaotic demands of human interaction. His property was secluded, accessible only by a long, winding driveway that discouraged casual visitors. He lived a life of quiet solitude, the silence broken only by the buzzing of his bees and the rustling of the wind through the trees. He was tending to his hives, the air thick with the scent of honey and the low hum of thousands of bees. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the clearing. He worked methodically, checking the frames, ensuring the health of his colonies. The work was demanding, physical, but it brought him a sense of peace, a connection to the natural world. But the tranquility of the scene was deceptive. The wilderness held its own dangers. Bears were a constant threat, drawn by the scent of the hives. He had lost several colonies to predators over the years, the wreckage a stark reminder of the fragility of his isolated existence. To monitor his property and protect his investment, Elias relied on technology. He pulled a high-end drone from its case, the sleek white device contrasting with the rustic surroundings. He launched it into the air, the propellers buzzing loudly as it ascended above the tree line. He piloted the drone with practiced ease, surveying the perimeter of his land. The drone's camera provided a bird's-eye view of the dense forest, the winding creek, the scattered clearings. He checked the fence lines, scanned for signs of predators. It was a routine flight, one he performed almost daily. He was banking the drone near the northern boundary line when he noticed something unusual. An isolated cabin stood on the adjacent property, a small structure hidden deep within the woods. He had believed the cabin was vacant, abandoned years ago. But today, a thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney. Curious, Elias zoomed in the drone's camera. The image sharpened, resolving into a scene that instantly put him on edge. A small child was playing in the overgrown yard, tossing a ball against the side of the cabin. The child looked young, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair tied back in pigtails. Before Elias could process the sight, the cabin door burst open. An adult woman rushed out, her movements frantic. She grabbed the child's arm, pulling them aggressively back toward the cabin. The child resisted, but the woman's grip was firm. She scanned the sky, her eyes narrowed before disappearing back inside, slamming the door shut. The child's brief appearance and the woman's secretive, paranoid behavior disturbed Elias. It felt wrong, the isolation of the cabin, the woman's obvious fear of being seen. It reminded him of something, a news story he had read years ago, a case that had captured the nation's attention. The Thompson twins, the 2 little girls who had vanished from their daycare. Elias hovered the drone over the cabin for a few more minutes, hoping for another glimpse of the child, but the cabin remained still, silent. He piloted the drone back to his property, the unsettling image etched in his mind. He reviewed the footage on his laptop, the grainy images confirming what he had seen. A child hidden in the woods, a woman desperate to keep them there. The resemblance to the missing twins was faint, obscured by the distance and the quality of the footage, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt in his mind. He wrestled with his conscience. He valued his privacy, his solitude. Getting involved in other people's business was not something he did lightly. But the image of the child, the fear in the woman's eyes, haunted him. He couldn't ignore it. He had to report it. The eye in the sky had seen a secret, and now the unwilling keeper of that secret had to decide what to do with it. Elias wrestled with his conscience for 2 days. The silence of the wilderness, usually a comfort, now felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of his discovery. He replayed the footage again and again. The grainy images of the child and the woman burned into his memory. He couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was happening in that cabin. Finally, hesitant but troubled, Elias drove to the local sheriff's office. The sterile environment, the buzzing fluorescent lights, the uniformed officers, it all felt alien, intrusive. He reported the sighting and presented the drone footage. The local deputies, recognizing the potential connection to a high-profile case, forwarded the information to Detective Miller. Miller studied the footage, his initial skepticism giving way to a growing sense of urgency. The child resembled the age-progressed images of the Thompson twins. The location was remote, isolated, the perfect place for someone trying to hide. He immediately called Jenna and Mark. They met at the police station, the tension in the small interrogation room palpable. Miller played the footage on a large monitor. Jenna leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the screen, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The footage was grainy, the images pixelated, but the scene was clear. The cabin, the child, the woman's frantic retreat, and in the background, barely visible through the trees, the unmistakable shapes of beehives. Jenna gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "The drawings," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The beehives. It's them. It has to be them." She recognized the landscape, the presence of the apiaries confirming her interpretation of the crayon images. She was convinced it was one of her daughters. The surge of hope was instantaneous, overwhelming. "You have to go there," she demanded, turning to Miller, her eyes blazing. "You have to raid that cabin. Now." Miller raised his hands, attempting to calm her. "Jenna, I know what this looks like. I know how compelling the connection to the drawings is. But we have a problem." He explained the harsh reality of the legal system. The footage was too ambiguous, the quality too poor. They could not secure a search warrant without positive identification of the child or the known kidnapper at that location. The presence of the beehives, while suggestive, wasn't enough to establish probable cause. "Probable cause?" Jenna exploded, the rage boiling over. "That's my daughter. You saw the drawings. You know what they mean. How can you wait? How can you let her stay in that cabin with that monster?" "I can't risk compromising the investigation," Miller insisted, his voice firm but strained. "If we move too soon, if we spook her, she could disappear again. And this time, we might never find her. We have to do this by the book." Jenna stared at him, the bureaucratic obstacles feeling like a betrayal. Time felt critical. Every minute they waited was another minute her daughter remained in danger. The police, constrained by rules and regulations, were failing her. The fury hardened into resolve. If the police couldn't act, she would get the proof they needed herself. She would find a way to identify the child, the woman, the location. She would not let this opportunity slip away. The realization that she would have to act independently, outside the bounds of the law, was terrifying. She was an accountant, not a detective. She had no training, no expertise in surveillance or investigation. But the alternative, waiting passively while her daughter remained in danger, was unacceptable. The desperation that had fueled her for the past 3 years now ignited a reckless determination. She would do whatever it took to bring her daughter home. The drive back from the sheriff's office was silent, the air in the car thick with unspoken tension. Mark gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his expression grim. Jenna stared out the window, her mind racing, the image of the grainy drone footage playing on a loop in her mind. "They're wrong, Mark," she said finally, her voice low and steady. "They're wrong to wait." Mark sighed, the sound heavy with exhaustion. "Jenna, we have to trust Miller. He knows what he's doing. We can't just go charging in there." "And what if she runs?" Jenna demanded, turning to face him. "What if she sees the police surveillance and disappears again? We'll lose her forever." "We don't know that," Mark argued, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know it," Jenna said, her eyes blazing. "I can't wait, Mark. I won't." She pulled out her phone and opened the photos of the drawings, the ones with the beehives. Then she opened the satellite maps she had been studying for weeks, the ones showing the locations of registered apiaries in the region. She cross-referenced the landmarks visible in the drone footage, the river, the clearing, the distinctive pattern of the trees, with the satellite maps. It was a painstaking process, a desperate attempt to pinpoint the location of the cabin. She found it, a small, isolated property bordering a larger expanse of land, registered to an Elias Matthews, a local beekeeper. "Elias Matthews?" Jenna said, the name feeling heavy on her tongue. "He's the neighbor. He's the one who took the drone footage." Mark looked at her, his expression alarmed. "Jenna, what are you planning?" "I'm going to talk to him," Jenna said. "I'm going to convince him to help us." "We can't do that," Mark protested. "We can't interfere with the police investigation." "The investigation is stalled," Jenna retorted. "We have to do something." She directed Mark to the address she had found. It was a long drive, deep into the rural countryside, the paved roads turning to gravel, the houses few and far between. They finally reached a long, winding driveway marked with a small sign. Matthews Apiaries. The driveway opened up into a clearing, a small farmhouse surrounded by towering pines and rows of beehives. A man was working near the hives, dressed in a white protective suit, a smoker in his hand. Jenna got out of the car, her heart pounding in her chest. She walked toward the man, her footsteps crunching on the gravel. The man turned, startled by her sudden appearance. He lifted the veil of his protective suit, revealing a weathered face, an untrusting gaze. It was Elias Matthews. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gruff, unwelcoming. "Mr. Matthews," Jenna began, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Jenna Thompson. I'm the mother of the missing twins." Elias stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "I know who you are. The police told me to stay away from the investigation." "I know," Jenna said, taking a step closer, "but they're not moving fast enough. I need your help." Elias shook his head. "I can't help you. I reported what I saw. That's all I can do." He turned away, dismissing her, returning to his work. "Please," Jenna begged, her voice cracking with desperation. "She's my daughter. I know she's in that cabin." She pulled out the photographs of the drawings, the ones with the beehives. "Look," she said, holding them out to him. "My daughter drew these. She drew your beehives." Elias hesitated. He looked at the drawings, his gaze softening slightly. He recognized the distinctive pattern of his hives, the childish scrawls capturing the essence of his secluded world. "The police say the drone footage isn't enough," Jenna continued, pressing her advantage. "They need a positive identification. They need proof." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "I need to get closer. I need to see her." Elias looked at the drawings again, then at Jenna's ravaged face, the raw desperation etched into every line. He saw the depth of her grief, the fierce determination of a mother fighting for her child. He sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. He valued his privacy, his solitude, but he couldn't turn away from this. "It's dangerous," he warned her. "The terrain is difficult." "And if she sees you?" He let the sentence hang unfinished, the warning clear. "I don't care," Jenna said. "I have to try." Elias nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll help you. I'll show you the way." A fragile alliance was forged, born of desperation and a shared sense of urgency. Jenna felt a flicker of hope, the first she had felt in years. She was taking control, rewriting the narrative, refusing to be a passive victim of circumstance. She was going to bring her daughter home. Elias guided Jenna and Mark through the dense, difficult terrain of his property. The Florida wilderness was unforgiving, a tangle of thick underbrush, swampy ground, and towering pine trees. The air was heavy with humidity, the silence broken only by the buzzing of insects and the snapping of twigs under their feet. They moved slowly, cautiously, Elias leading the way with a practiced ease that belied the difficulty of the trek. Jenna was driven by adrenaline, her exhaustion masked by the desperate urgency of her mission. Mark struggled to keep up, his face pale and strained, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They were civilians, untrained, unprepared for the physical demands of the hike. After nearly an hour of hiking, they reached a ridge overlooking the adjacent property. Below them, nestled in a small clearing, was the cabin. It was small, rustic, heavily isolated. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, the only sign of life. "This is as close as we can get without risking exposure," Elias said, his voice low. He pointed to a dense thicket of palmettos. "You can set up there. It offers good concealment and a clear line of sight to the cabin." They established a concealed observation post, armed with a high-end camera equipped with a powerful telephoto lens, binoculars, and a small supply of water and food. Elias showed them how to move silently, how to blend into the landscape, how to minimize their presence. He then retreated, leaving them alone on the ridge, the weight of their task settling over them. They began their surveillance. The silence was absolute, the tension palpable. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through Jenna. They were terrified of being spotted, of making a mistake that could cost them everything. The physical discomfort was intense. The heat was oppressive, the humidity suffocating. Insects swarmed around them, biting at their exposed skin. They remained motionless for hours, their muscles cramping, their eyes fixed on the cabin. Jenna scanned the clearing, the binoculars pressed tightly against her eyes. She memorized every detail of the cabin, the overgrown yard, the rusted swing set. She searched for any sign of movement, any glimpse of her daughter. The first 24 hours were agonizingly slow. The cabin remained silent, still, no movement, no activity. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. The darkness brought new fears, the sounds of the wilderness amplified in the silence. Tension built between Jenna and Mark. The grueling conditions, the uncertainty, the fear, frayed their already strained relationship. The shared grief that had once united them now seemed to push them apart, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken accusations and regrets. "We can't stay here indefinitely," Mark whispered, his voice tight. "It's too dangerous. If she sees us—" "We stay as long as it takes," Jenna insisted, her voice low and fierce. "I am not leaving without proof." Mark sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. He knew she was right. They had come too far to turn back now. They settled in for the long night, the cabin below a tantalizing enigma, holding the answers to their deepest hopes and fears. The stakeout had begun, a test of endurance, patience, and resolve. They were closer than they had ever been, but the distance between them and the truth still felt impossibly vast. The wilderness held its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Day 2 of the stakeout dawned gray and overcast, the threat of rain hanging heavy in the humid air. Exhaustion was setting in, the lack of sleep and the constant tension taking their toll. Jenna's muscles ached. Her skin was raw from insect bites, but she remained hyper-alert, her eyes fixed on the cabin, refusing to yield to the fatigue. The morning dragged on, the silence broken only by the monotonous dripping of water from the trees. Jenna and Mark took turns watching, allowing the other brief moments of rest. But the inactivity was agonizing. Doubts began to creep in. Had they been wrong? Had the drone footage been a cruel coincidence? Late in the afternoon, the stalemate broke. The cabin door opened. Jenna, who was on watch, immediately raised the binoculars to her eyes, her heart leaping into her throat. A woman stepped out onto the porch. She was carrying a basket of laundry, her movements brisk, efficient. She began hanging the clothes on a makeshift line stretched between two trees. Jenna focused the binoculars, her hands trembling. The woman was older than she remembered, her face weathered, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. But the features were unmistakable. The shape of her eyes, the set of her jaw. It was her. Carol Peterson, Catherine Glass. The shock and rage were visceral, a physical blow that left Jenna breathless. The woman who had destroyed her life, who had stolen her children, was standing just a few hundred yards away, engaged in the mundane task of hanging laundry. The normalization of the scene was grotesque. "Mark," Jenna whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It's her." Mark scrambled into position, the camera with the telephoto lens ready. He focused on the woman, the shutter clicking rapidly. But the woman seemed agitated, her movements jerky, paranoid. She frequently stopped what she was doing, scanning the tree line, her eyes narrowed, as if sensing their presence. She seemed particularly focused on the ridge where they were hidden. Jenna and Mark froze, pressing themselves deeper into the concealment of the palmettos. They held their breath, the silence stretching taut between them. Had she seen them? Had they made a sound? The woman stared at the ridge for a long, agonizing moment. The tension was unbearable. Jenna could feel the sweat trickling down her back, the pounding of her heart loud in her ears. Then, apparently satisfied, the woman turned back to the laundry. A few minutes later, she gathered the empty basket and retreated back inside the cabin, the door closing behind her with a definitive click. Jenna let out a shaky breath, the adrenaline receding, leaving her weak and trembling. They had seen her. They had confirmation. But the victory felt hollow. Mark reviewed the photos on the camera's small screen. "They're not clear," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "The shadows from the porch overhang, the foliage. They obstruct her face. It's not enough for positive identification. Miller won't be able to use this." The realization hit Jenna with crushing force. They had been so close, but they still didn't have the proof they needed, and they still hadn't seen the child. The question hung unspoken between them. Where was Mia? Where was Lily? The hope that had flared with the sighting of the woman curdled into a cold, agonizing fear. The stakeout continued, the tension mounting, the stakes higher than ever. The monster had shown her face, but the shadows still concealed the truth. Day 3. The near miss of the previous afternoon had shaken them, emphasizing the precariousness of their situation. They returned to the observation post before dawn, moving with heightened caution, acutely aware of the woman's paranoia. The air was cooler, a brief respite from the oppressive heat, but the tension remained suffocating. The morning passed without incident. The cabin remained still, the woman hidden inside. Jenna's impatience grew, the proximity to the cabin agonizing. She wanted to rush down the ridge, tear open the door, demand answers. But she knew that would be disastrous. They needed proof. They needed patience. In the early evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden light across the clearing, the cabin door opened again. This time, the woman didn't emerge immediately. Instead, she stood in the doorway, scanning the perimeter, her posture tense, alert. Then she stepped aside, and a small figure emerged from the darkness of the cabin. A child. Jenna's breath hitched. She raised the binoculars, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold them steady. The child walked into the yard, blinking in the fading light. She was taller than Jenna remembered, thinner, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore clothes that were too small for her movements hesitant, uncertain. Jenna focused the binoculars, the image swimming before her eyes. And then the child turned, her face visible in the dim light. The breath left Jenna's body. It was Mia. Unmistakably, undeniably, her daughter. The shock of seeing her, alive after 3 years of agonizing uncertainty, was overwhelming. Jenna felt a sob rising in her throat, a strangled cry of relief and anguish. She nearly cried out, the sound catching in her throat. Mark grabbed her arm, his grip tight, restraining her, pulling her back behind the cover of the bushes. "Don't," he whispered, his voice urgent. "Don't make a sound." Jenna struggled against his grip, her eyes fixed on Mia, the urge to run to her, to hold her, overwhelming. But she knew Mark was right. She couldn't jeopardize the mission. Not now. The joy of seeing Mia alive was immediately tempered by a chilling realization. Lily was not there. Mia was alone. The unspoken question, the fear that had haunted Jenna since the discovery of the blood-stained playroom, solidified into a devastating certainty. Lily was gone. Mark, driven by the same surge of adrenaline, focused the camera on Mia. The shutter clicked rapidly, capturing clear, unobstructed images of her face. They had confirmation. They had proof that Mia was alive, that she was being held in this cabin. But they still needed the crucial piece of evidence. Catherine clearly identified at this location. The warrant depended on it. And Catherine remained partially hidden by the shadows of the porch overhang, her face obscured, her posture radiating vigilance. They watched as Mia played, the silence stretching taut, the tension unbearable. Every minute felt like an eternity. They were so close, yet the final piece of the puzzle remained elusive. The darkness deepened, the shadows lengthening, threatening to swallow the clearing and the hope that had flared so brightly. Jenna watched her daughter, the ache in her chest, a physical pain. Mia looked so small, so fragile, so lost. The urge to run to her, to hold her, to protect her, was overwhelming. But she remained frozen, trapped by the constraints of the situation, the fear of making a mistake that could cost her everything. They couldn't afford to lose this opportunity. They needed Catherine to step into the light. The confirmation had been made, but the battle was far from over. Day 4. The confirmation of Mia's presence had galvanized Jenna, but it had also ignited a reckless impatience. Knowing her daughter was just a few hundred yards away, held captive by the woman who had destroyed their lives, was agonizing. Every instinct screamed at her to act, to intervene, to rescue her child. The passive surveillance felt increasingly futile, an agonizing exercise in self-restraint. Catherine, seemingly sensing the heightened scrutiny, remained inside the cabin for most of the day. The windows were covered, the door remained closed. The inactivity was excruciating. Jenna paced the small confines of the observation post, her movements agitated, restless. "We have to do something," she whispered to Mark, her voice tight with frustration. "We can't just sit here and wait. What if she leaves? What if she takes Mia and disappears again? We can't let that happen." "We wait," Mark insisted, his voice low and strained. "We wait for her to make a mistake. We wait for a clear shot. We can't afford to be reckless, Jen. Not now." But Jenna couldn't wait. The fear of losing Mia again was overwhelming, overriding her rational judgment. As dusk began to fall, casting long shadows across the clearing, she formulated a desperate plan. "I'm going to move closer," she announced, her decision made. "Under the cover of darkness, I need to find a better vantage point for the morning, a place where the shadows won't obstruct the view, a place where I can see her face." Mark grabbed her arm, his grip tight. "Jenna, no, it's too dangerous. If she sees you, if she hears you, she could hurt Mia. She could run." "I have to, Mark," Jenna insisted, pulling away from him. "I can't risk losing her again." "I won't." Ignoring Mark's protests, Jenna slipped out of the observation post and began making her way down the ridge, moving slowly, cautiously, through the dense underbrush. The darkness was both a comfort and a threat, concealing her movements but also hiding the dangers of the terrain. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. She reached the edge of the clearing, the cabin looming before her, a dark silhouette against the night sky. She crouched behind a large oak tree, her heart pounding in her chest. She was closer now, the distance narrowed to mere yards. The faint glow of a lamp illuminated the edges of the curtains, a tantalizing glimpse of the life inside. She scanned the perimeter, searching for a better vantage point. She saw a small shed near the back of the cabin, a potential spot that would offer a clear view of the porch. She began moving toward it, staying low to the ground, the silence amplifying every sound. Every step was agonizing, every snap of a twig a potential disaster. Suddenly, a blinding light flooded the clearing. A motion-activated floodlight, mounted above the cabin door, had been triggered. Jenna froze, exposed in the shadows at the edge of the light. Her breath hitched. She pressed herself against the rough bark of the tree, praying for invisibility. The silence stretched taut, agonizing. The cabin door opened. Catherine stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the harsh light. She peered intently into the darkness, her posture tense, alert. She scanned the clearing, her eyes sweeping over the area where Jenna was hidden. Jenna remained motionless, paralyzed by fear. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears, the frantic hammering of her heart. She waited for the inevitable confrontation, the scream of alarm, the realization that she had compromised everything. The seconds stretched into an eternity. After a tense, agonizing moment, Catherine seemed to relax. She dismissed the light as triggered by an animal, a raccoon or a deer. She turned and went back inside the cabin, the door closing behind her with a soft click. The floodlight remained on for a few more minutes, then plunged the clearing back into darkness. Jenna let out a shaky breath, the adrenaline receding, leaving her weak and trembling. She retreated, scrambling back up the ridge, her movements clumsy, desperate. She had been reckless, foolish, and she had almost paid the price. The near discovery was a stark reminder of the danger they were in, the fragility of their situation. They couldn't afford another mistake. The impatience had almost cost them everything. Now they needed a new strategy, a smarter approach. The near miss of the previous night had sobered them. The night approach was too risky. Catherine was hyper-alert, paranoid, her vigilance heightened by the isolation and the years of hiding. They couldn't rely on patience alone. They needed to force her hand. They needed to create a situation where she had no choice but to reveal herself. They gathered at the observation post, the tension thick between them. They needed a distraction, something to draw Catherine out into the open, away from the shadows of the porch, and force her to reveal her face. But it had to be something that wouldn't immediately signal a threat, something that would pique her curiosity or annoyance. "We need to create a diversion," Mark said, his voice low. "Something that will make her curious, not fearful. Something that will draw her into the clearing." "Like what?" Jenna asked, her mind racing. They had limited resources, limited options. They couldn't risk anything that might endanger Mia. Then Elias, who had joined them that morning, spoke up. "The drone." They turned to him, their expressions questioning. "We use the drone," he explained, his voice calm, methodical. "We fly it close to the cabin. We make it noisy, erratic. We simulate a malfunction, and then we crash it." The plan began to take shape. The noise and the crash would draw Catherine out to investigate. A crashed drone would be a curiosity, an anomaly in the isolated wilderness, not an immediate threat. It would force her to step into the clearing, into the sunlight, giving Mark a clear shot of her face. It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble. If Catherine realized the surveillance, if she found the drone's camera and realized it had been recording her, she would likely flee immediately, taking Mia with her. They would lose everything. The drone was expensive, a crucial tool for Elias's work, but the potential reward outweighed the risks. But it was a calculated risk. They were running out of time, out of options. The passive surveillance had reached its limit. They needed to act. "We have to do it," Jenna said, her voice firm, the decision made. "We have to take the chance. This is our only shot." They spent the next hour preparing. Elias checked the drone, ensuring the camera was working, the battery fully charged. He programmed a flight path that would simulate the malfunction, the erratic movements convincing enough to fool even a paranoid observer. Mark checked his camera, adjusting the settings, preparing for the shot. He knew he would only have a few seconds, a fleeting moment to capture the image that would change everything. Jenna's role was to monitor Catherine's reaction, to alert them if she showed any signs of panic or suspicion. The tension mounted as the morning wore on. The sun climbed higher in the sky, the light growing brighter, harsher. The conditions were perfect. "Ready?" Elias asked, his hand hovering over the drone's controls. Jenna nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ready?" The gambit was set. The fate of their daughter, the culmination of 3 years of searching, hinged on this single, desperate act. The silence stretched taut, the anticipation unbearable. The wilderness held its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. The trap was laid. Now they just had to wait for the prey to take the bait. Elias launched the drone. The propellers buzzed loudly, the sound amplified in the silence of the clearing. Jenna and Mark were in position at the new observation post, concealed by the dense foliage, the camera ready. Jenna watched the drone climbing rapidly, a small black speck against the pale blue sky. She held her breath, the anticipation making her nauseous. The drone reached the cabin, hovering above the tree line. Then Elias initiated the simulated malfunction. The drone dipped and swerved, the noise amplified, erratic. It buzzed loudly over the cabin, the sound unnatural, intrusive. Jenna raised the binoculars, her gaze fixed on the cabin door. The door opened. Catherine rushed out, her expression agitated, angry. She looked around frantically, trying to identify the source of the noise. She scanned the sky, her gaze sweeping across the clearing. Then she spotted the drone. It was hovering erratically, dipping lower, closer to the ground. Elias maneuvered the drone, drawing her attention, pulling her away from the cabin, into the center of the clearing. Then he crashed it. The drone hit the ground with a loud thud, the propellers snapping, the silence returning abruptly. Catherine froze, startled by the sudden crash. She hesitated, looking around suspiciously. Then, cautiously, she approached the crashed drone. She stepped into the sunlight, away from the shadows of the porch, her face fully exposed. "Now," Jenna whispered, her voice urgent. Mark focused the lens, the camera aimed directly at Catherine. She bent down to examine the drone, her expression curious, confused. The shutter clicked rapidly, the sound capturing the moment, the undeniable proof. Mark lowered the camera, his hands trembling. He reviewed the photos on the screen, his expression triumphant. "I got her," he whispered, his voice filled with relief. "Clear, unobstructed. The identification is undeniable." Jenna felt a surge of adrenaline, the relief so intense it made her dizzy. They had done it. They had the proof they needed. The years of frustration, the agonizing wait, the desperate gamble, it had all led to this moment. The image of Catherine's face captured on the camera screen was the key to bringing Mia home. The victory was short-lived. The danger was far from over. They had the proof, but they still had to get Mia out, and they had to do it before Catherine realized what had happened. The clock was ticking, and the final act of the drama was about to unfold. The relief was short-lived, a fleeting moment of triumph before the reality of their situation crashed down on them. They finally had the proof, the undeniable identification of Catherine Glass at the secluded cabin, but they still needed to get it to the authorities, and they needed to do it before Catherine realized what had happened. Jenna immediately started transmitting the digital photos to Detective Miller from their location using a mobile hotspot. The signal was weak, the transmission slow, the progress bar crawling across the screen. Every second felt like an eternity, the agonizing wait stretching Jenna's nerves to the breaking point. Meanwhile, down in the clearing, Catherine continued to examine the drone. She circled it, studying it from different angles. Her curiosity turned to suspicion. The drone was too sophisticated, too expensive to simply fall out of the sky. Then she noticed something. The camera lens attached to the underside of the drone, pointing directly at the cabin. Her expression shifted instantly. The anger and agitation vanished, replaced by sheer panic. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The drone crash hadn't been accidental. It was deliberate. She was being watched. She looked up, her eyes scanning the ridge where they were hidden, her gaze filled with terror and rage. Jenna froze, the fear clutching at her throat. Had Catherine seen them? Had she pinpointed their location? Catherine didn't wait to find out. She sprinted back to the cabin, her movements frantic, desperate. Jenna's phone buzzed, a message from Miller. "Photos received. Identification confirmed. Mobilizing tactical team. ETA 2 hours. 2 hours. The realization hit Jenna with crushing force. They didn't have 2 hours. They didn't even have 20 minutes. "She knows," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. She saw the camera. "She knows we're here." Through the binoculars, they could see Catherine moving frantically inside the cabin, throwing things into bags, her movements jerky, panicked. Mia stood nearby, confused, frightened. The idyllic scene of the isolated cabin shattered, replaced by the chaotic reality of a fugitive preparing to flee. "She's running," Mark said, his voice tight. "She's taking Mia and running." Miller called, his voice urgent. "Jenna, the team is on their way, but you need to leave the area. Do not engage. I repeat, do not engage. She is dangerous. Wait for the tactical team." Jenna ignored him. She couldn't wait. If Catherine left, if she disappeared into the vast wilderness, they might lose Mia forever. The 2 hours stretched before her, an impossible eternity. The fear was overwhelming, paralyzing. But the thought of losing Mia again, of failing her when she was so close, ignited a primal instinct. The passive observer role was over. She had to act. "We have to stop her," Jenna said, her voice hardening with resolve. "We have to stop her from leaving." The decision was made. The waiting was over. The confrontation was inevitable. The silence of the wilderness was about to be shattered by the sounds of a desperate struggle. The climax was here, and they were the only ones who could determine the outcome. Jenna didn't hesitate. Driven by a primal instinct that overrode all fear, all caution, she scrambled down the ridge towards the cabin. The descent was treacherous, the terrain steep and uneven, but she moved with a reckless abandon, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. The loose gravel shifted beneath her feet, the thorny bushes tearing at her clothes, but she ignored the pain, her focus entirely on the cabin, on Mia. "Jenna!" "Wait!" Mark shouted, scrambling after her, Elias close behind. They had to stop her. They had to intercept her before she reached the car. The realization that they were about to confront a dangerous kidnapper, unarmed and untrained, was terrifying, but the alternative was unbearable. Catherine emerged from the cabin, dragging a confused and crying Mia towards the old sedan parked behind the cabin, hidden from view, the engine already running, the exhaust sputtering plumes of smoke into the air. Jenna broke through the tree line just as Catherine was trying to force Mia into the passenger seat. The distance between them was mere yards. "Catherine!" Jenna screamed, the name tearing from her throat. She used her real name, the name Miller had given her after the identification. "Stop!" Catherine froze, shocked at being confronted, at hearing her real name. She turned, her eyes wide with terror and rage. She still held Mia's arm in a vice-like grip. The child was sobbing, her small body trembling with fear. "Stay back!" Catherine shrieked, her voice hysterical. "You can't have her! She's mine. She's my daughter." The confrontation was chaotic, explosive. The years of repressed grief and rage erupted from Jenna. "She's my daughter! Let her go, you monster!" "I'm her mother now?" Catherine screamed, her delusion cracking under the pressure. "You died. You and Mark died in the car accident. I saved her. I protected her." Mia was terrified, caught between the woman she had known as her mother for the past 3 years and the stranger claiming to be her parent. She clung to Catherine, burying her face in her skirt, sobbing uncontrollably. The trauma of the situation, the sudden disruption of the reality she had known, was overwhelming. The scene was a nightmare tableau. The isolated cabin, the hysterical kidnapper, the traumatized child, the desperate parents. The silence of the wilderness shattered by the screams of rage and fear. "Catherine, it's over," Mark said, approaching slowly, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "The police are on their way. Don't make this worse. Let her go." Catherine laughed, the sound high-pitched, hysterical. "No. We're leaving. You can't stop us. You can't take her from me." She turned back to the car, trying to shove Mia inside. The desperation mounted, the fear clutching at Jenna's throat. They were so close, yet the distance between them and Mia felt impossibly vast. The interception had failed. The confrontation had escalated. The situation was spiraling out of control. The nightmare was repeating itself, the agonizing loss of her child unfolding before her eyes once again. Catherine managed to shove Mia into the car and scrambled into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, the tires spinning on the dirt road. The car lurched forward, heading towards the narrow driveway leading out of the clearing. "No!" Jenna screamed, lunging towards the car. Mark reached the driver's side door just as Catherine was shifting the car into gear. He yanked the door open, the metal screeching in protest. He grabbed the keys from the ignition, the engine sputtering and dying. "Get out!" he roared, pulling Catherine from the car. Catherine fought back with a desperate fury, scratching, biting, kicking. They tumbled to the ground in a chaotic struggle. The fight was messy, brutal, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. Catherine was fighting for her freedom, for the delusion that had sustained her for years. Mark was fighting for his daughter, for the future of his family. While Catherine was distracted, Jenna ran to the passenger side and opened the door. Mia was huddled on the seat, sobbing hysterically, her eyes wide with terror. "Mia, baby, it's me," Jenna pleaded, her voice choked with emotion. "It's Mommy." "You're safe now." Mia shook her head, pressing herself against the seat, trying to get away. "No, you're dead. My mommy died. New Mommy told me." The years of manipulation, the psychological trauma, had taken their toll. Mia didn't recognize her. The realization hit Jenna with crushing force. The physical proximity was meaningless without the emotional connection. Desperate, Jenna searched her memory for something, anything that could break through the conditioning, that could reach her daughter. And then she remembered the lullaby, the specific song she used to sing to the twins every night before bed, a melody she had composed herself. A simple tune, a silly rhyme, but it was theirs. She began to sing, her voice trembling, broken, but filled with a desperate love. Little stars, shining bright, guiding you through the night. The melody hung in the air, a fragile thread connecting the past to the present, a familiar sound in the midst of the chaos. The effect was instantaneous. Mia's sobbing subsided. She looked at Jenna, her eyes wide, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. The melody pierced the fog of confusion and fear, awakening a memory buried deep within her subconscious. "Mommy's here, holding you tight." "Mommy?" she whispered, the word tentative, questioning. The turning point. The moment the delusion shattered, the truth breaking through the years of lies. The bond between mother and child, fractured but not broken, finally reconnected. In that moment of recognition, Mia stopped fighting to stay with Catherine. She reached out to Jenna, her small hand trembling. Jenna pulled Mia from the car, wrapping her arms around her, holding her tight. The physical contact was overwhelming, a visceral connection that transcended the years of separation. The scent of her daughter, the feel of her small body in her arms, it was everything she had dreamed of. Catherine, seeing Mia in Jenna's arms, let out a primal scream of rage. She broke free from Mark and lunged toward Jenna and Mia, her face contorted in a mask of fury. But before she could reach them, the sound of sirens echoed through the woods. The cavalry had arrived. Police vehicles swarmed the property, surrounding the cabin, the flashing lights painting the clearing in shades of red and blue. The rescue was complete. The nightmare was over. The silence of the wilderness was broken by the sounds of justice, the echoes of a family reunited. The tactical team secured the scene quickly, their movements efficient and precise. They secured the area, handcuffing Catherine Glass, who continued to struggle, her hysterical screams echoing through the woods. She clung to her delusion even as she was taken away, shouting for Mia, proclaiming her motherhood, her voice raw with desperation. Jenna barely noticed. Her entire world had narrowed to the small, trembling figure in her arms. She held Mia tightly, rocking her back and forth, whispering reassurances, the physical reunion, overwhelming, intoxicating. Mia clung to her, her small hands gripping Jenna's shirt, her face buried in her neck. The contact was electric, a reconnection that transcended the years of separation. Paramedics arrived, gently checking Mia for injuries. She was thin, malnourished, but physically unharmed. The emotional wounds, however, were deep, profound. She was withdrawn, traumatized, the emotional distance palpable even amidst the physical proximity. She didn't speak, her eyes vacant, haunted by the ghosts of the past 3 years. Mark stood beside them, his hand resting on Mia's back, his eyes filled with tears. The relief was overwhelming, a tidal wave of emotion that left them weak, trembling. But the reality of the long road to recovery was evident. The years of manipulation, the isolation, the trauma had changed their daughter. The vibrant, smiling child they remembered had been replaced by this haunted figure. The reunion was incomplete. The joy was tempered by grief. The absence of Lily hung over the scene like a shroud. The unspoken question, the fear that had haunted Jenna for years, demanded an answer. The silence surrounding Lily's fate was deafening. Jenna finally found the strength to ask. She pulled back slightly, looking into Mia's eyes, her voice trembling. "Mia, baby, where is Lily?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Mia hesitated, her eyes darting around the clearing, as if searching for an escape. The question seemed to trigger a new wave of trauma. She began to tremble, her her breath hitching. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. "She's gone," Mia whispered, her voice so low Jenna could barely hear her. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" Jenna pressed, the dread coiling in her stomach. She needed to hear the truth, no matter how painful. "The accident," Mia said, her voice breaking. "At the old house." The hidden room. She pointed towards the cabin, her small hand trembling. She fell. There was so much blood, she couldn't wake up. The implication hit Jenna with the force of a physical blow. The blood-stained playroom, the drawings depicting only one child, the agonizing uncertainty, coalesced into a devastating certainty. Lily was gone. The void that had opened in her life 3 years ago expanded, threatening to swallow her whole. The relief of Mia's rescue was immediately overshadowed by the crushing weight of grief. The nightmare wasn't over. It had just taken a new, more agonizing shape. The silence was broken, but the echo of the tragedy remained, a haunting reminder of the price they had paid. The interrogation room was small, sterile, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and despair. Detective Miller sat across from Catherine Glass, the silence stretching between them. Catherine had been read her rights, her hysterical outbursts subsiding into a sullen defiance. She refused to speak, her eyes fixed on the table, her posture rigid. The delusion that had sustained her for years was a shield against the harsh reality of her situation. Miller had been interrogating suspects for decades. He recognized the signs of a breaking point. The evidence was overwhelming, the rescue of Mia undeniable. He just had to wait for the cracks to appear. He placed the photographs of the blood-stained playroom on the table, the eerie blue glow illuminating the cramped space. "We know what happened in that room, Catherine," he said, his voice low, calm. "We know about the accident. We know about Lily." Catherine flinched, her eyes darting towards the photos. The defiance began to crack. The mention of Lily's name seemed to pierce through the layers of denial and delusion. "Mia told us," Miller continued, pressing his advantage. "She told us everything." The lie was calculated, designed to exploit the emotional vulnerability of the suspect. And it worked. Catherine's composure shattered. She began to weep, the tears streaming down her face, her body trembling. The breakdown was sudden, complete. The dam of denial burst, unleashing a torrent of guilt, delusion, and despair. Hours into the interrogation, the confession spilled out. She detailed their isolated life, the homeschooling, the attempts to create a twisted version of a family. She explained what happened in mid-2021, the event that had forced her to flee the rental property. Lily, she explained, had been playing in the outbuilding, in the hidden room. She had fallen against a sharp, rusty object, a piece of discarded farm equipment stored in the adjacent garage. The object had pierced her side, causing massive bleeding. Catherine had panicked. The blood was everywhere, soaking into the carpet, seeping into the floorboards. Lily was losing consciousness, her breathing shallow, terrified of being exposed, of losing Mia, of the consequences of her actions. Catherine didn't call 911. She tried to stop the bleeding herself, using towels, pressure, but it was futile. Lily died from blood loss, the life fading from her eyes in the cramped confines of the hidden room. The tragedy was senseless, preventable. A childish accident transformed into a fatal event by Catherine's desperation and fear. The silence of the hidden room became a tomb, the bloodstains a permanent reminder of the life that was lost. In the aftermath, consumed by panic and grief, Catherine made a desperate decision. She couldn't leave Lily's body behind. She buried her in the woods behind the rental property, the shallow grave a testament to her desperation. Realizing the property was now compromised, that the body could be discovered, that the accident could be traced back to her, she immediately abandoned the location. She fled with Mia to the secluded cabin deeper in the wilderness, hoping to disappear forever, to continue the delusion that had become her reality. The truth about Lily, the agonizing confirmation of Jenna's worst fears, was finally revealed. The ghost that had haunted the investigation for years was finally laid to rest. The silence was broken, the mystery solved, but the pain remained, a permanent scar on the lives of those left behind. Miller delivered the final devastating confirmation to Jenna and Mark at the hospital, where Mia was undergoing a thorough evaluation. The news, while expected, was a crushing blow. The grief for Lily, repressed for years by the agonizing uncertainty, finally erupted, a tidal wave of sorrow that threatened to drown them. They grieved their lost daughter, the vibrant, smiling child who would never grow up, even amidst the complex joy of Mia's return. The sterile environment of the hospital room felt suffocating, the beeping of the monitors a relentless reminder of the fragility of life. They clung to each other, the shared grief a heavy blanket smothering the flickering flame of relief. Authorities executed a search warrant at the first rental property. Using Catherine's confession, they located the shallow grave in the woods. The recovery operation was grim, somber. Lily's remains were recovered, the forensic analysis confirming the cause of death consistent with Catherine's account. The small white coffin was a stark symbol of the tragedy that had unfolded in the hidden room. Jenna and Mark held a funeral for Lily. It was a small, private ceremony attended only by family and close friends. They buried their daughter under a large oak tree, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the freshly turned earth. The closure was agonizing but necessary. It allowed them to begin the long, difficult process of healing. The legal proceedings against Catherine Glass began. The trial was a media spectacle, the details of the abduction, the years of captivity, the tragic death of Lily, captivating the nation. The courtroom was packed every day, the air thick with anticipation and sorrow. The full scope of Catherine's obsessive planning was revealed. Driven by a recent divorce and her inability to have children, she had meticulously constructed a fabricated identity, targeting the Thompson twins, exploiting Jenna's trust. Her husband had left her for another woman, a betrayal that had fueled her desperate desire for a family of her own. The defense argued that Catherine was delusional, mentally ill, that Lily's death was a tragic accident. They painted a picture of a lonely, desperate woman who had made a terrible mistake. But the prosecution countered with evidence of her calculated manipulation, her sophisticated deception, and her callous disregard for the life of a child. The phone spoofing, the hidden room, the decision not to call 911 were presented as evidence of her guilt. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict? Guilty on all counts. Kidnapping, custodial interference, negligent homicide. Catherine Glass was sentenced to life imprisonment, the courtroom erupting in a mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring Lily back. It couldn't erase the trauma of the past 3 years. The scars remained, a permanent reminder of the fragility of life, the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the mundane. The silence of the courtroom was broken by the sound of Jenna's muffled sobs, the agonizing closure of a chapter that should never have been written. In the aftermath of the trial, as the media attention faded and the world moved on, Jenna and Mark began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding their lives. The trauma had changed them, hardening them in some ways, softening them in others. They were survivors, bound together by the shared experience of loss and the fierce love for their daughter. They formally thanked Elias Matthews, the reclusive beekeeper whose vigilance and willingness to help had broken the case open. They visited his cabin, the clearing now peaceful, the buzzing of the bees a comforting soundtrack to their gratitude. Elias remained a solitary man, but a bond had formed between them, a silent understanding of the darkness they had faced together. Their primary focus was Mia. They dedicated themselves entirely to her intensive therapy, the sessions painful but necessary. Slowly, gradually, Mia began to process the trauma, the loss of her sister, the years of manipulation. She started to talk about Lily, the memories bittersweet, the grief raw and unfiltered. She began to reconnect with her parents, the bond strengthening, the trust rebuilding. The healing process was not linear. There were setbacks, nightmares, moments of withdrawal. But Jenna and Mark were patient, steadfast, their love a constant anchor in the swirling chaos of Mia's recovery. The trauma galvanized Jenna. The grief and the rage transformed into a new purpose. She couldn't bring Lily back, but she could try to prevent other families from suffering the same fate. She began advocating for stricter national protocols regarding emergency contacts and identity verification in daycare centers. She emphasized the dangers of phone spoofing, the loopholes in the system that allowed predators like Catherine to exploit the trust of caregivers. She became a voice for the voiceless, a warrior fighting for the safety of children. The work was exhausting, emotionally draining, but it gave her a sense of meaning, a way to channel her grief into something positive. The final scene unfolded on a bright spring morning. Jenna, Mark, and Mia stood before Lily's grave. The cemetery was peaceful, the grass green and lush, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers. They stood by the small white headstone, the silence comfortable, companionable. Mia placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the grave, her small hand tracing the letters of her sister's name. They were healing. The scars remained, the loss a constant presence in their lives. But they were moving forward, finding a way to live with the grief, to honor Lily's memory. They were a family, forever changed, but unbroken. The echo in the pines had been answered, the silence broken, the darkness receding in the face of the enduring power of love and resilience. The future stretched out before them, uncertain, but filled with the promise of hope.